I sighed as I finally walked through the gates of my apartment complex. The day turned out to be unusually hot, even for a city like Mumbai, where the summer was already unbearable. The heat, humidity, and fatigue were complemented by a heavy bag of groceries in my hands and a large bag over my shoulder. Beads of sweat collected on my forehead as I awkwardly walked towards my building. On the way, I noticed a taxi standing at the entrance. It was a car from one of the many service companies that have popped up in the country over the past few years. The trunk of the taxi was open, and inside I saw a couple of bags. The driver was sitting in the car and turned around to look at me as I walked past. His lustful gaze did not escape my attention. Bastard. I thought about the driver and continued on my way. As I approached the elevator, I noticed the out-of-service sign hanging on the door. Since my apartment was on the third floor, I almost didn't need an elevator. I kept myself in shape so that I could easily climb stairs. But with a bag of groceries in my hands and a dehydrated body, this climb seemed like a real challenge. I cursed under my breath and began to drag myself up the stairs to my floor. Slowly and awkwardly, I made my way to my apartment and placed the grocery bag on the steps. I started looking for my keys in my bag when I heard footsteps coming from above. Looking up, I saw a tall, slender man descending towards me. From his fair skin and blonde hair, I immediately realized that he was a foreigner. He stopped a few steps away from me. His height, combined with the extra inches from the steps, made him even taller. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something. But he looked down, and I followed his gaze, noticing that my grocery bag was blocking his passage. We made eye contact, and I just smiled awkwardly, pushing the bag aside. He smiled back, lifted the visor of his baseball cap, and continued down the stairs. I immediately picked up the bag of groceries and noticed that he was looking at me while he was coming down. His gaze was not as obvious and lustful as the taxi driver's, but still remained the gaze of a man appraising a woman. Being a woman, and a beautiful one at that, I had long been accustomed to such glances, and even curious glances, so I did not attach any importance to it and entered my apartment. I freshened up, drank a couple of glasses of water, and started cooking. I was in the kitchen when I heard the doorbell ring. Who could it be in the middle of the day? As I approached, I opened the door and saw my neighbor and friend Rupali. "Hello, Ria," said Rupali, entering my apartment. "Hello, Rupali," I answered, closing the door behind her. Rupali and I have known each other since I moved here 5 years ago. She lived here a year longer than me. We were both in our early 30s and quickly became friends. "We have a new neighbor," Rupali said, following me into the kitchen. "I know," I answered. "He's clearly not from here, you know," she continued. "I know," I repeated. "How do you know?" She was surprised in her usual high voice. Being the local gossip, she was clearly upset that I found out the news before her. "I saw him." "He just walked past me," I said, trying to calm her bruised ego. "Ah, do you know his name?" she asked. "No, I don't know," I answered. Hearing this, she immediately perked up, because now she could tell me something I didn't know. "His name is Jacques. He's from France. His company sent him to their office in BKC, and he came to India a couple of days ago. Before that, he lived at the Marriott. Mayra rented out his apartment to him, and now he will live here," she blurted out in one breath. I smiled, amused by her enthusiasm. "How did you find out all this? Are you a spy like James Bond?" I asked. "Ha ha ha. No, just talk to him," she replied. So you decided to welcome him to our area, right?" I asked with a grin, teasing her. He. "No, no, just out of politeness. You know what a good neighbor I am," Rupali replied, trying to justify her curious nature. Yes, of course," I said with slight irony and laughed. Rupali joined in my laughter. "What are you cooking for lunch?" she asked, walking over to the countertop and looking into one of the pots. "Nothing special. As usual," I answered. "Your ordinary is always special to me. I love your cooking." "I'm not in the mood to cook today, so I'll stay at your place for lunch," she said. "Hey, Okay, I replied, and we both returned to cooking. It had been a few days since Rupali had stopped by for lunch, and we were discussing our new neighbor. This time I needed to go grocery shopping again, but I decided to avoid the heat of the day and went to the store in the evening. As I approached the store, I heard some noise. The seller, Radichan, spoke loudly, almost shouting at the man whose back was to him. "No, I don't know English. No, what do you want?" Radichan repeated irritably. I heard the man speak, but it was clearly not English. I came closer to figure out what was happening. Seeing me, Radichan immediately addressed me. "Oh, madam, look what this foreigner is saying. I don't understand anything." The man turned around hearing Radichan address me, and I could see his face. It was a Frenchman from my house, Jacques. Smiling at the cultural confusion, I moved closer. Jacques answered me with an awkward smile, apparently also feeling out of place. "What do you want?" I asked him in English, confident that he would understand me. However, I was wrong. He looked confused, as if he was trying to comprehend my question. I repeated my question, this time accompanying it with a characteristic Indian hand gesture, as if indicating what. "Eggs. I want eggs," he said. "And what?" I answered. I understood that he was speaking French, but at that moment I was as confused as Radichan. Jacques thought for a moment, and then he put his hands under his arms and began to wave them like a chicken. He even started cackling and then put his index finger and thumb in a circle. I laughed when I realized what he meant. "Baya, give him a dozen eggs," I told Radichan, who looked relieved and nodded approvingly when I solved the riddle for him. Radichan returned with a dozen eggs, and Jacques looked happy to finally have what he wanted. "Mercy," Jacques said, looking at me and smiling softly. I was not an expert in French, but I knew a few words. "Please," I replied. Jacques took a loaf of bread, paid Radichan, and left the store. I continued shopping for groceries, and a good 15 minutes later, I left the store with a large bag. When I came out, I saw Jacques standing there smiling at me. He was waiting for me all this time. I smiled back, and he walked next to me. I didn't mind. Perhaps he was being polite to the woman who helped him in this foreign place. We walked slowly, without saying a word. I had a huge bag of groceries in my hands, and I walked just as awkwardly as last time. He noticed this and immediately took the bag from my hands. I didn't have time to say anything, and I didn't want to, because it was a relief to get rid of a heavy burden. "Hi, Jacques," he said, holding out his hand for a handshake. "He, and I'm Rhea," I replied, shaking his hand. The first thing I noticed was that his hand was too big compared to mine. During the handshake, she completely covered my hand. The next thing that caught my eye was how easily he carried the heavy bag of groceries in one hand as he walked alongside. "Nice to meet you," he said with a smile. "It's nice to meet you too," I replied, and we continued on our way. Soon I noticed another detail. Jacques was very tall. Really tall. I'm 5'7", which is considered tall for an Indian woman, but Jacques towered over me by at least half a foot, making him taller than 6. His slender build emphasized his height, but he was clearly not skinny. I realized this when I saw his sculpted forearms and biceps while he was carrying a bag. He had blonde hair, a common feature for a European, and his skin was white. Not just blonde, but white. Even the fairest-skinned Indian was darker than him. His blonde hair and white skin complemented his blue eyes, which seemed fake, like he was wearing contacts, but I was sure it was a natural color. We reached our house and got into the elevator, all the while having awkward conversations, he in his broken English, and I tried to answer. In the cramped, enclosed space of the elevator, I noticed that he emanated a pleasant aroma of good cologne, which added to his charm. We reached the door of my apartment. I opened it and invited him inside. He came in, put his bag on the dining table, and was about to leave when I invited him to stay. He smiled shyly and remained where he was. "Do you want coffee?" I asked, gesturing towards the sofa for him to get more comfortable. "Cafe?" he asked. "Yes, a cafe," I replied. Yes, mercy," he said with a boyish smile. I smiled back and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Returning after a while, I saw Jacques still sitting on the sofa and looked a little tense. I placed cups of coffee on the table, as well as some snacks. I handed him a cup of coffee and sat down opposite him, handing him a plate of typical Indian snacks. He looked at them with interest before I told him to try them. Jacques seemed to enjoy the appetizers. This may have been his first experience of Indian cuisine. The snacks weren't too spicy, even for his taste, and he nodded with satisfaction as he chewed some more. "What is this?" he asked with a thick accent. "Chivda," I answered. "Ha," he asked again. This word apparently struck him as a real tongue twister. "Kaida," I repeated, laughing. "Oo, kai wada. This is delicious," he said, laughing. He immediately took out a small pocket notebook from his jeans and began to read something in it. I wondered what he was doing. "What are you doing, Ria?" he asked. "I'm a school teacher," I answered, looking at his puzzled face. He buried his head in his notebook again, and then raised his head and said, "Professor." "Yes, professor," I answered, understanding him for the first time without further explanation. "What do you do?" I asked in response. "Engineer," he answered in his French manner, and I understood. Maybe talking to him won't be as difficult as it seemed. For the rest of the time, Jacques and I spoke briefly, continuing to get to know each other. Unnoticed, the coffee was finished, the snacks were eaten, and it was time for him to leave. He stood up and headed towards the door. I saw him off, and on his way out he said, "Au revoir." "Bye, Jacques," I replied, closed the door, and returned to my business. Since then, life has become quite relaxed, with schools closed for the summer holidays. I went about my household chores at a leisurely pace, unlike the usual hustle and bustle when I worked. I had a full 2 months before classes started, and my husband was at sea until the end of the year, so I had a lot of free time. So I decided to go jogging every morning around our apartment complex. Several women from our complex were out for morning walks, but I preferred jogging to walking. Plus, I wanted to focus on exercise and not gossiping with older ladies. One of these days, I woke up early to go for a run. I wore a regular t-shirt and a pair of leggings. I wore leggings not to show off my figure, although, to be honest, that would have been nice, but because they were comfortable and provided sufficient freedom of movement. I was used to the looks of other women judging me for wearing what they considered revealing clothes inappropriate for a married woman of 30. Fuck you, I thought. The women were finishing their couple of laps around the park and heading home, and I was finishing my 5th lap and decided to run 5 more before heading home. Soon the park was empty, and I was the only person left on the treadmill. While jogging, I heard footsteps behind me. They sounded getting closer. I didn't turn around to see who it was, but I was aware of someone's presence, thinking it was one of the neighbors, and continued running. "Hello, Ria." I heard Jacques' characteristic voice next to me. He ran next to her and smiled his usual boyish smile. At first I was surprised, but realizing that it was him, I smiled back, and we continued jogging. "Today, Sunday, is a day off," he said. "Ooh, I know. Great," I replied. "Do you run every day?" I asked, realizing that he did not understand my question from his puzzled face. "Is this something you do every day?" I asked, pointing at him, hoping that he would understand. Yes, I get up early, but today is Sunday. So it's late," he replied. Apparently, he's an early bird because I haven't seen him on the treadmill before. We slowly walked back to our house after our run. The summer sun did not spare even in the morning, and I was sweating. My damp t-shirt stuck to my body, clearly outlining the curves of my toned figure. I had noticed him sneaking glances at me as we ran, but now that we were face to face, he looked more openly. "You're a teacher, right?" he asked, taking a sip from his drink bottle before offering it to me. I was tired and thirsty and couldn't resist the delicious drink, so I grabbed it and took a big sip. "Yes," I answered, taking another sip. "What do you teach?" he asked. "I teach English literature at school," I answered. "Tree-bon. Will you teach me how to speak English? He asked. Ah, ah, I don't know. I don't give private lessons, I answered hesitantly. I barely knew the man and had absolutely no experience teaching English to foreigners. Because of their colonial past, Indians, even without formal education, are quite proficient in English, so teaching them, especially children, was not that difficult. But teaching a man who has absolutely no connection with English, I just wasn't sure. Besides, I didn't even expect such a request. Please, without English. Ah, très difficile. To live here, he said, understanding my indecisiveness and trying to convince me. Um, I'll think about it, I answered, but he continued to persuade me. I had never taught a foreigner before, but Jacques was not completely unfamiliar with English. He could speak at a basic level, so I wouldn't have to start from scratch. I thought a little more and decided to try it. This will be a new experience, I thought. Okay, Jacques, I will teach you, I answered, to which he smiled sweetly. His dimpled cheeks, snow-white smile, and blue eyes made him very cute, almost childlike, but at the same time his sweat-soaked shirt and muscular arms showed him to be a real man. Shall we start after lunch? He asked. Okay, I answered. On a boring afternoon, I had nothing to do, so I decided to devote more time to my favorite thing, studying. Come in. Please sit down. I pointed to the dining table in the living room. It was already late afternoon. I had finished all my work when Jacques knocked on my door. He was wearing a loose white t-shirt and black shorts. His blonde hair was damp, perhaps from a shower or from the unbearable summer heat. He had a light, day-old stubble on his face that accentuated his prominent jaw. He sat down at the dinner table, and I served him a cold drink and some snacks. He brought with him several books. These were mainly textbooks for foreigners who wanted to learn spoken English, as well as a couple of books on self-development. He also had an English-French dictionary, which should have been of great help to us. I understood that Jacques did not want to learn grammar and all the complexities of the language, but rather wanted to learn how to speak everyday English. So I had to adapt my approach to focus on learning words, pronunciation, and basic grammar to write correct sentences. We were sitting just a few feet away from each other, and I caught the scent of his cologne. The pleasant aroma emanating from him distracted me. Because my husband spent months at sea, I often felt a lack of physical intimacy at home, and my heightened, hungry body immediately picked up on this smell. He repeated after me the phrases that I taught him. He smiled sweetly when he got confused about words or their pronunciation. If he didn't know the meaning of a word, he looked in the dictionary and learned quite a lot in one lesson. Are you married? He asked as I placed a cup of tea in front of him and joined him at the dining table. Yes, married. Do you see this chain around my neck? This is called Mangal Sutra. In India, this is a sign that a woman is married, I explained, telling a little about our culture. He works in the merchant navy, ship. I tried to explain my husband's profession. Jacques opened the dictionary and flipped through several pages before settling on the one he needed. After a moment, he raised his head and smiled at me, indicating that he understood what I said. He's been on the ship for months, right? He clarified. On a ship, not on a ship, and yes, he is away for months at a time, I answered, simultaneously fulfilling the role of a teacher. Don't you ever, get bored? He asked, frowning. Well, I'm used to it. What can you do? That's his job, I sighed. My husband earned good money, but was often far away. I visited his ship twice, but the endless seas quickly bored me. This was not a cruise ship with lots to do. It was an oil tanker with a crew of 25-30 people working long hours. The only entertainment on board was a stack of DVDs, which I watched on repeat during the tedious journey. After that, I never set foot on his ship, preferring to wait for him on land. You are married? I asked him. No, but there is a girl, he answered, turning his smartphone over so the screen was facing me. He showed a photograph of a cute blonde woman in her mid-20s wearing a white turtleneck sweater. In the photo, Jacques himself stood next to the girl, and it was obvious that this was a selfie. You probably miss her, I asked. Yes, "I miss you very much," he answered with slight sadness, or perhaps loneliness in his eyes. "She's very beautiful," I said, trying to cheer him up. He looked at me, smiled, nodded, and said, "You are also very beautiful." I smiled and blushed, which surprised me a little. It wasn't that this was the first time I had been called beautiful, but I was surprised that I blushed like a young girl at such a simple compliment. "Thank you," I replied, brushing aside my thoughts. "I have no friends here. Will you become my friend?" he asked and extended his hand to me. "Of course, Jacques." "We're friends," I answered, shaking his hand. We smiled at each other and continued talking until he left. "Hi, Ria, sorry. I'm, uh, late," Jacques said, approaching me. I stood next to the treadmill in our apartment complex, waiting for him to join me for his morning run. 3 weeks have passed since I started teaching Jacques, and we have become good friends. In addition to conversational English lessons, we discussed many different topics, which not only brought us closer, but also improved his knowledge of the language. Another common feature was our passion for sports. One day I noticed Jacques on the treadmill, but he said that he usually runs in the early morning when it is calm and cool. He invited me to join him, and I agreed. Since then, several days have passed since we ran together. "It's okay, Jacques." "I just got here," I replied as he stopped next to me. We headed to the grassy area in the center of the running track to do some pre-run stretches. We stood just a few feet apart, facing each other. We started with arm and wrist rotations. To stretch my legs, I bent over to touch my toes and counted to 5 before straightening up again. Jacques repeated my movements, but when I stood up, I noticed that he was looking at me. I looked at him but didn't say anything. His behavior was a little strange, as if he had stumbled upon something fascinating. It was only a few moments later that I realized what he was looking at. I leaned down to touch my toes again, and this time I looked at him to see what it was that had caught his attention. I noticed that he was looking at my chest. My crewneck t-shirt opened slightly as I bent over, revealing my cleavage. From that angle, he could see my cleavage and black bra. I cleared my throat, trying to get his attention. "Mr. Jacques, come back to Earth," I said, standing up. He seemed to snap out of his trance when he heard me and awkwardly tried to say something. I was amused by his loss of words and chuckled quietly at his confusion. What exactly stopped him from justifying himself, his poor English, or the lack of words and a suitable excuse, I did not try to find out. This wasn't the first time someone had stared at my breasts. Depending on which person was looking at me, they would either notice my face or my bust, and Jacques was no exception. Usually, if I noticed someone looking at me like that, I would glare at him angrily. But for some reason, I didn't feel irritated with Jacques. I don't know what stopped me. When we finished stretching, we put on our headphones, turned on some music, and started jogging. We barely spoke during the run, saving our energy for conversations before or after training. I completed the 4th circle, concentrating on the music in my ears and the path in front of me as usual. For a moment, I glanced to the side and noticed Jacques running slightly behind me, but his eyes were not focused on the track, but on my ass. I looked at him for several seconds before he noticed that I had caught him. This time, he didn't even try to come up with an excuse, but just smiled slyly. And again, I was not offended by his frank look. Any unpleasant feelings disappeared under the influence of his boyish smile and dimple in his chin. I smiled shyly back at him, and he stretched his lips even further into a smile that was filled with relief and joy. I turned forward and continued running, but deep down I knew that with my smile, I had just given him unspoken permission to continue. Part of me was lost in thoughts about my reaction or lack thereof, another part felt slightly indignant, and a third enjoyed the man's attention. Immersed in these thoughts, I didn't notice how I completed my usual 10 laps. Jacques may have realized that he shouldn't take too much advantage of the situation and sped up to run alongside. It seems he decided to put an end to this moment. We entered the elevator, starting our usual small talk, but as soon as the doors closed, we both fell silent, as if by unspoken agreement. In the metal cabin, we stood just a step away from each other. Our eyes met. I smiled awkwardly, and he smiled back with the same amount of embarrassment. I noticed how his gaze slowly slid down from my eyes to my chest, then to my stomach and legs. My heaving chest and sweat-drenched hair must have been quite a sight for him. He stood in front of me in a white sleeveless t-shirt with drops of sweat on his forehead, several of which flowed down. A thin layer of sweat covered his white skin, giving it a glow. Greenish veins stood out on his arms as he clutched the water bottle. His black shorts showed off his smooth but muscular thighs and large calf muscles that looked particularly defined. The elevator stopped on my floor, and the sound of the doors opening brought us back to reality. Without saying anything, I left and immediately headed home. Walking inside, I plopped down on the sofa, not believing what had just happened. I went over our entire morning conversation in my memory, and with each memory, my surprise at my actions only grew. I allowed a man who was not my husband to look at me. I didn't say anything when he looked at my breasts, and I didn't stop him when he openly looked at my buttocks. But what struck me most was that I liked it. I silently gave my approval, and the game of glances in the elevator only made the situation worse. I decided to put it all out of my mind and do chores. Perhaps they would distract me from the events of the morning. I went into the bedroom to change out of my wet clothes and take a shower. Stopping in front of the mirror, I looked at my reflection. The first thought that came to mind was, this is how I looked in his eyes. Unconsciously, I leaned forward, and the crewneck of my t-shirt parted a little, revealing the sight Jack must have been enjoying on the treadmill. I was so stupid that I didn't wear a sports bra that day, and it was in this state that Jacques saw me. I straightened up and slowly turned my back to the mirror. My firm, round butt bulged out noticeably from the tight leggings that perfectly accentuated its shape, including my lower curves. No wonder he looked at her with such admiration. I went to the shower, undressed, and stood under the stream of cold water. Closing my eyes, I replayed the morning events in my head again and again, each time remembering exactly those moments when he looked at me. Jacques once told me that he was 28 years old, and I was 34. There was a 6-year difference between us. Why is a young, handsome European man interested in an ordinary Indian woman? With these thoughts and memories returning, I finished my shower, walked out of the bathroom, and wrapped a towel around myself. Approaching the dressing table, I began to comb my hair, but thoughts of Jacques did not leave me. Setting the comb down, I untied the towel and let it fall to the floor. In the mirror, I saw my naked body, and this gave me the answer. Hi, Riai. Rupali waved at me in her usual shrill, high-pitched, enthusiastic way. She called me Riai, shortening my full name Ria. I was returning home from a nearby ATM when I saw her. Her behavior always made me smile. She is 32 years old and acts like a child. Hi, Rups, I replied, shortening her name the same way she abbreviated mine. What are you doing? She asked, stopping next to our building. Yes, nothing special. Spending my summer holidays doing housework and stuff, I replied with a sigh. Besides this, do you seem to be doing anything else? Rupali said with a slight mockery, her eyes sparkling with playful intent. What do you mean? I asked, frowning in surprise. This Frenchman is simply smitten with your charm, she said, and then giggled. What? What are you even talking about? I asked, trying to brush her off. English lessons, morning runs. Something is going on here, she said naively and playfully, teasing me the way teenagers tease each other. What nonsense. He asked me to teach him English because he knows that I am a teacher, and I've been calling you for morning runs for a year now, but you're too lazy to get up early. All other women also go irregularly. And by the way, I know that your husband leaves for work without lunch in his bag and without breakfast in his stomach, you lazy beast, I answered, immediately stopping all her further attempts. Her smug, mischievous smile turned into a frown at my comment. Years of communication with her taught me to skillfully repel her attacks, and I enjoyed it. Hahaba, relax, I was just joking. There is nothing between me and Jacques, I said, putting my hand on her shoulder to slightly console her wounded pride. Will you come to my place for tea? I asked. She nodded silently, and I smiled, pulling her closer. "Hi, Ree." I heard it just as we were about to enter my house. We both turned around and saw Jacques walking towards us. He was wearing a white shirt and gray trousers and had black shoes on his feet. It seemed like he had just returned from work. "Hello, Jacques," Rupali drawled in a tone that was more of a mockery of me than a greeting to him. "Hello," he replied with an awkward smile, catching her intonation. "Is the work finished?" I asked, quickly pushing Rupali aside in this conversation. "Yes," Jacques answered shortly. I felt uncomfortable saying more in front of Rupali. She was already teasing me, and I didn't want to give her even more reasons to gossip. Jacques also realized this, nodded slightly, and froze in front of us with an awkward smile. "Goodbye," he said. "Bye," I replied. "Bye, Jacques," Rupali sang, nudging me with her elbow and giving me her sly smile. Jacques smiled even more awkwardly, but charmingly, and turned and walked towards the elevator. "He's just crazy about you," Rupali almost shouted in my ear as soon as the elevator doors closed behind Jacques. I winced at her shrill voice, which was loud enough for anyone else to hear. "Shut your mouth. Are you coming for tea or not?" I abruptly interrupted her. She nodded, and we headed to the elevator. "But you have to admit he's hot," she added as the elevator moved upward. "I agree with that," I replied, winking at her. She also winked back. It's been a couple of weeks since I noticed Jacques sneaking an eyeful of my curves on the treadmill. We met every morning for a run, first a warm-up, and then a few laps around the track. I didn't protest against the fact that he sometimes looked at me, although every time I thought that I should say something. But in the end, she didn't say anything. He didn't bring it up either, but I saw that he was secretly watching me. However, he didn't take my silence as an invitation, and he certainly didn't act like a rude person. A real bore would look lustfully or indulge in excess, but Jacques was not like that. Although I would sometimes catch his eye on my breasts or thighs, he would immediately turn away, feigning innocence, as soon as he noticed me looking at him. I felt funny at such childish behavior, and I couldn't help but smile. One day, after finishing my morning run, I returned home and went about my normal business. I didn't have a housekeeper, so I preferred to do everything myself. This way I burned calories and kept the house in order. After collecting freshly washed clothes from the dryer, I put them in a basket and went out onto the balcony to hang them. While I was busy hanging clothes, I noticed someone on the balcony one floor above. I looked up and saw Jacques. He stood on the balcony shirtless, with a towel wrapped around his hips and a cigarette in his hand. He smoked leisurely, looking at the city panorama and occasionally glancing at the street. The first thing I noticed was that he was in great shape. Broad, muscular shoulders flowed into sculpted collarbones. His pecs were well defined, with noticeable lines, and even from a distance I could tell they were hard. His abs were just like a picture, defined six-pack and bulging obliques. He had no hair on his chest, which impressed me a little. I have always liked men with smooth skin, but my husband flatly refused to shave his chest. He believed that hair is a sign of masculinity, and models are not real men. But looking at Jacques, I knew he was a very real man. The balcony was closed on both sides by walls, and in front there was only a railing, so everything was visible. His towel was tied low, just below his navel, and reached to his knees. I noticed something protruding from his groin area and gasped when I realized what it was. Is he excited? I thought. If so, that would be impressive. And if not, then it was even more impressive. It is unlikely that the panorama of the city could be so exciting as to explain this. So, either way, I was impressed. As I stared blankly at him, he noticed my presence. He quickly put out his cigarette, threw it on the floor of the balcony, and began waving at me with his usual boyish smile. This gesture brought me back to reality. I smiled too and waved back. We were at quite a distance, so it was difficult to talk to each other. We just continued to smile at each other for a couple more minutes. He gestured that he had to go, I nodded, and just as he was about to leave, his towel fell to the floor. He froze in shock from the unexpected trouble and began frantically picking up the towel. In a normal situation, any person would avert his eyes so as not to embarrass the other, but I shamelessly continued to look at his clumsy attempts to regain his modesty. I giggled quietly and didn't look away. Finally, he managed to tie the towel again. His cheeks were flushed, and he smiled shyly, clearly feeling awkward. I was still chuckling when he waved me goodbye and went into the apartment. I returned to the house, continuing to laugh at what had happened. However, the laughter gradually died down when I remembered what I had seen. For a split second, I caught sight of his naked body, and that was enough to understand what he was wearing under the towel. I was sure that no one could experience arousal at such an awkward moment. But even in a calm state, his dignity was greater than what I had seen before. I pushed thoughts of his body away before I felt aroused again and went back to work. It was an unusually hot and humid summer day, even for a city like Mumbai. I had just finished lunch and was lying on the couch, lazily watching TV. Daytime television programs were two boring talk shows, boring soap operas, and reruns of previous boring soap operas. I was about to go to sleep when I heard the doorbell ring. Startled, I got up from the sofa, went to the door, and, opening it, saw Jacques. "Hey, Ria, can I, uh, come in?" he said. I smiled at him and invited him into the house. "What brings you here?" I asked, sitting down on the sofa opposite him. "The office is closed today, and I have nothing to do. I haven't seen Mumbai yet, those, uh, famous places," he said in his broken, heavily accented English. "Will you show me the city? I'd really like to see him." "I only saw him on the way to and from the office," he asked with his usual boyish charm and embarrassment. I thought for a second. What important things did I have to do? None. What would I do if I stayed at home? Nothing but to take a nap. The decision was made. "Okay, give me half an hour to get ready, and I'll meet you at the gate," I replied. He smiled at me and stood up to leave. Half an hour later, I was walking to the gate of the complex. I was wearing a white t-shirt and faded blue jeans, and on my feet were low-heeled shoes. I applied strawberry balm to my lips and put on sunglasses to protect myself from the bright light. With my purse in hand, I walked up to the gate and saw Jacques, who, by a strange coincidence, was also wearing a white t-shirt and faded blue jeans. We smiled at each other, realizing that we were wearing the same colors. "I hope your jeans are buttoned tightly this time." "I wouldn't want to get into an awkward situation in public," I said, laughing. Jacques grimaced, remembering the incident with the balcony, and then smiled awkwardly. I continued to laugh, remembering this incident. He called a taxi, and we headed towards the India Gate. It was the most famous monument in the city, a symbol of India's colonial past, and what better way to start the tour than with it? Half an hour later, we arrived at the place, and having paid the taxi driver, approached the monument. This monument was built by the British in honor of the arrival of the royal couple King George V and Queen Mary in 1911. I began to tell Jacques the history of the monument. I told him about the Taj Mahal Hotel and the history of Mumbai in general. Jacques listened to me with attention, nodding his head from time to time and sincerely looking at the places to which I pointed. When the historical excursion was over, it was time for photographs. Jacques took out his phone and began enthusiastically taking pictures of everything, like any other tourist. Even the most insignificant things fell into the frame. "We need to take a photo together," Jacques said, beckoning me. "Of course, why not?" I answered, approaching him. He stood next to me and picked up his phone to take a selfie. I smelled his cologne mixed with his natural scent, creating an intriguing blend of masculinity. He gently took my hand and said, "Smile." Just as we were about to smile and the camera was ready to capture the moment, he lightly squeezed my hand and pulled me closer. I felt his touch as clearly as I heard the click of a camera. He continued to keep me close under the pretext of showing me a photo. I stood silently, letting him hold my hand. "Let's take another photo on your phone," he suggested, and I couldn't refuse. I took the phone out of my purse and handed it to him. He turned on the camera and pulled me in again, this time putting his arm around my waist. He carefully slipped his arm between my waist and my arm, hugging me tenderly. We smiled for the camera again, but at that moment Jacques suddenly moved his hand under my t-shirt and squeezed my waist. I jumped in surprise, and the photo was ruined. "Oh, you moved," he said, pretending that it had nothing to do with it. In fact, it was he who ruined the photo, but I didn't tell him about it. I just blushed embarrassedly. Encouraged by my reaction, he offered another photo and asked me not to move. The cunning boy continued to hold me by the waist, as if this was completely natural. We stood up again for the photo. This time I decided to take the initiative, and when the camera was ready, I lightly spanked his firm ass. Jacques looked at me in surprise, but then smiled. My unexpected behavior gave way to shyness as he looked at me with admiration. We ended up taking the perfect photo, hugging even closer. Then we went to Café Leopold, a popular place among locals and tourists. The mood after the moment at the gate became relaxed, and we communicated freely. After drinking a couple of bottles of beer and having a snack, we headed to the next attraction, the Sea Promenade. "This place is called the Queen's Necklace," I said, sitting with him on the platform and looking out to the sea. "Why?" he asked, looking around puzzled. "You will understand when you see this place at night," I answered and looked at the sea again. In the back of my mind, I began to replay all the events of the day in my memory, wondering where this was all going and whether I was doing the right thing. My thoughts were interrupted by Jacques asking where we would go next. We strolled along the boardwalk before calling it a day. We decided to take a double-decker bus back, which was a leisurely and iconic way to travel in Mumbai, unlike the famous local trains. I didn't want Jacques to be shocked by the crazy crowds on the trains, but I wanted him to have pleasant memories of the city. As we were riding on the bus, I noticed how quickly the sky became covered with dark clouds. Just a few minutes ago, the sun was shining brightly, but now thunderous rain seemed inevitable, and it began. Rain lashed the streets of Mumbai. When the bus arrived at our stop, we had no choice but to get off. Without an umbrella or any shelter, we decided to walk home in the rain. There was no point in running because our houses were quite far away, and we would end up getting wet anyway, and the trees didn't provide enough shelter. So why waste energy running and risk slipping? We decided to walk home, completely wet. I opened the door to my house, and we both went inside. I hurried to the bedroom to get a couple of towels and dry myself off. She began to dry her hair, watching Jacques do the same. He was sitting on a chair at the dining table, drying his head, when I walked over, took the towel from him, and sat down on the chair opposite to help him. I ran the towel over his head several times, and he tilted it in time with my movements. I giggled at his childish behavior and continued. "Patch high, patch high." Jacques sneezed. I realized that he was at risk of catching a cold and quickly took off his wet shirt without even realizing what I had done. I partially undressed a man, practically a stranger, in my living room. Part of me tried to justify it as concern for his health and good intentions, but another part realized what I was doing. I sat, looked at him, and thought about my actions until I noticed that he was looking at me. He leaned forward, bringing his face closer to mine, his lips only an inch from mine. I continued to look at him as he approached cautiously. I felt the light touch of his lips and pulled back. My heart began to pound as I realized what had just happened, but I couldn't find the strength within myself to stop it. He leaned closer again, his lips gently touching mine, but he continued to look at me as if looking for a sign. I did not react, remaining motionless, and perhaps this was the signal for him. He completely covered my lips with his. I closed my eyes, feeling his soft lips on mine and his breath touching my face. For a few moments we remained motionless, simply touching each other's lips in silence. He took the first step and began to move his lips. I still didn't react, didn't move, while he kissed me deeper and deeper. My body froze with surprise, fear, and awkwardness, but all this disappeared when he gently squeezed the wet hair at the back of my head and pulled me closer. I kissed him back, and he became more and more passionate. Our lips eagerly sought each other, our pulses quickened. Everything happened right in the living room. Without breaking the kiss, Jacques moved my chair closer to his, bringing me closer to him, and again focused on the kiss. I placed one hand on his thigh, feeling the wet fabric of his jeans, and the other on the armrest of the chair. One of his hands lay on my shoulder, and the other gently touched the back of my head, stroking my wet hair, which excited me even more. He lifted me from the chair and sat me on his lap, and I obeyed silently. This time I hugged him and kissed him. I held his face in my hands, and he held me as we kissed like a couple who had just started dating. I felt his hand gently squeeze my breast, and I moaned softly, both in pleasure and in protest at how quickly things were progressing. But I didn't stop, but continued to kiss him while his hand squeezed my breast. Jacques quickly pulled off my wet t-shirt, and I simply raised my hands so as not to disturb him. As soon as the t-shirt was removed, we started kissing again, and he caressed my breasts at the same time. His hand slid to my back, undoing the clasp of my bra. He was almost taking it off when suddenly my phone rang. I stepped away to answer the phone, thanking God for his timely intervention before things went too far. "Hello," I said, still trembling from the cold and what was happening. "Hello, honey, it's me," I heard my husband's voice on the other end. My heart started beating faster, and I checked the number. It was the one he used in India. "I'm coming home," my husband said joyfully. "Where are you now, my love?" I asked. "I have already landed in Cochin. I have a week's vacation, and I decided to spend it at home with you. I'll be home tomorrow." I returned to the living room, standing a couple of steps away from Jacques, who was still sitting on the chair and looking at me intently. "Okay, dear, come quickly. I'm waiting for you," I said before hanging up. I left the phone on the table and looked at Jacques. I noticed that he didn't look me in the eyes. I followed his gaze and realized that he was looking at my naked breasts. The phone rang the moment he unclasped my bra, and in my haste to leave, I didn't notice it. And so, he saw me almost naked. Just terrible. I ran to the bedroom, hearing Jacques laughing loudly. I frantically searched for something decent to cover myself with, but couldn't find anything. I grabbed a towel, wrapped it around my chest, and walked back into the living room. Jacques stood at the door, ready to leave. "We're even now, Ria," he said before laughing loudly. All I could do was blush with shame. He opened the door and went out. "Did you take the keys to the house?" I asked my husband Varun, standing at the entrance to our apartment. "Yes, I did, and also the car keys," he replied, closing the door and locking it. "We were going to dinner and then to the cinema." When my husband returned home from a long sail, we often went out because that was the only time we could enjoy each other's company as a married couple. In the evenings, we went to the cinema, club, or restaurant and spent the rest of the day lazing around at home or having sex. Varun still had 2 days of his week's vacation left, and the day after tomorrow he went back to the ship, not returning home for several months. 5 days have passed since that fateful night when Jacques and I kissed in my living room. Although my husband's timely call prevented us from going too far, I was still embarrassed, remembering how he looked at my bare breasts. However, part of me couldn't help but smile as I relived the moment in my mind. Varun and I were about to get into the car when we saw Jacques. He was entering the building. First, he smiled at me and nodded, and then stopped in front of us. "Hi, Jacques," I said, smiling. "Hi, Ree," he replied. "Varun, this is Jacques, our new neighbor, whom I told you about the other day." I introduced Jacques to my husband. "Hello, I am Varun, her husband. Nice to meet you," Varun said, smiling and extending his hand to Jacques. "Mutually," Jacques replied, shaking Varun's hand. "My wife says she is teaching you to speak English. She's an excellent teacher, but don't forget to pay for the lessons." "Ha ha," Varun jokes, laughing. Jacques and I joined in the laughter. "I won't forget," Jacques replied. "Hey, Jacques, I'm only here for a couple of nights. Why don't you join us for dinner tomorrow night? We will be glad to see your company, and you will be able to appreciate Indian hospitality. How do you like this idea?" Varun suggested. "Damn it," was my first thought when I heard my husband's words. He was inviting someone to dinner with whom I had just had an intimate moment just a few days before. I couldn't blame him because I didn't tell him the whole truth. He knew only what he needed to know. But the very thought of my husband and this man being together for a cozy dinner, and even in my presence, made me nervous. Men are likely to drink beer. What if Jacques said something inappropriate, or worse, did something inappropriate after a couple of drinks? Not only will this end in a fight, but it will also ruin my marriage. While I was thinking about how to prevent this plan, Jacques said with a smile, "Sounds great." Damn, I thought. How can I stop this nonsense? Jacques looked more than pleased with the invitation, although he tried to hide his excitement. And my husband, not knowing anything, looked completely calm. Then we agreed. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock, Varun clarified and Jacques nodded, after which they shook hands again. Men decided everything without me men. Thank you. Ah, Ree, you look beautiful today. Very beautiful sorry, Jacques praised me. I was wearing a blue chiffon sari and a black blouse. Her hair was loose and hung down over her shoulders to the middle of her back. Varun liked it when I left my hair loose, and I used to accommodate him. Thank you, Jacques, I replied with a smile. What else could I say at this moment? Obviously, canceling dinner would be rude, and explaining the reasons would be even more difficult. I just smiled and remained silent, feeling my heart beating faster in my chest. Well, what do you say about my suit? Varun asked, and both men laughed again. I forced out a fake laugh, trying to hide my anxiety. We said goodbye to Jacques and hit the road. Good evening. Come on in. I heard my husband's voice from the kitchen. I looked at my watch. It was 5 minutes past 8, and realized that Jacques had already arrived. I was busy cooking and didn't go out to meet him. I've been preparing for dinner since the evening. Knowing that Europeans have a low tolerance for spicy food, I decided to tone down the traditional Indian dishes I prepared for tonight's dinner. After a while, I came out into the living room and saw my husband pouring drinks for himself and Jacques. I smiled at Jacques, and he responded with a slight smile and a nod. He sat in a chair with his hands on the armrests. Varun turned on some football match. I didn't know which teams were playing, and I didn't care, but the men seemed keen. I returned to the kitchen to serve the appetizers. I poured the nuts into a bowl, put the chicken tikka I had prepared on a plate, and returned to the living room. Varun sat in a chair opposite Jacques, both looking at the TV a few feet away. I set the snacks on the table, then walked over to Jacques with a plate of tikka. I leaned over, handing him the plate. Jacques looked up at me, then lowered his gaze to my chest. Taking a piece of tikka with a toothpick, he continued to look at my cleavage. They're just great, he said, and winked at me. I looked at him with wide eyes, knowing perfectly well what he was talking about. My husband was sitting just a few feet behind me, and this man was complimenting my breasts. Outrageous. I stood opposite Jacques, with my back to Varun, which prevented him from seeing where Jacques was looking and what he was saying. Judging by the husband's silence, he was carried away by the match. Shock gave way to embarrassment. I blushed and looked at Jacques, who was now looking at me with a knowing smile, chewing the meat. I turned and walked towards Varun to offer him tikka, all the while fearing that he would notice my blush, but luckily he didn't. The men continued to watch the match, while I returned to the kitchen to check on the main course. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. I thought it was Varun and turned around to say something, but saw Jacques. I tensed up when he approached me. Could my silence and embarrassment give him a reason for something more? I simply turned to the kitchen table and continued cooking. He stood next to her, lightly touching the tabletop, and took a sip from his glass. I just wanted to thank you for this chicken you cooked and asked your husband to let me do it in person. He agreed. He explained his presence nearby. Thank you, I replied, smiling weakly at him, and then looked down at the tabletop. He came up behind me, and before I could turn around, I felt his hand gently brush my hair behind my ear. I gasped and froze, scared to death of what he was doing. He touched me in ways he shouldn't have when my husband was just a few steps away. I felt his breath on my neck and realized how close he was to me. He brought his lips to my cheek and kissed me tenderly before pulling away. I stood motionless. My heart was pounding, My pulse quickened. I realized what had just happened. Even though it was just a light kiss on the cheek, it was completely unacceptable on his part. He left the kitchen, and I was still standing, holding the edge of the countertop, trying to comprehend what had happened. A minute later, I returned to cooking. I needed to act as normal as if nothing had happened so that my husband would not suspect anything. When dinner was ready, I returned to the living room and sat on the arm of the chair in which Varun was sitting, silently watching the match. My thoughts returned again and again to what happened in the kitchen. I wasn't interested in football at all. I could hear the men cheering from time to time about the events on the field, but my thoughts were still spinning around what had happened in the kitchen and other recent events. The match ended quite quickly, and Varun asked me to serve dinner. I took the dishes into the dining room, and Varun took out the plates and cutlery. We sat down at the dining table. I made chicken biryani, Varun's favorite dish. I was sure Jacques knew this too, since it is one of the most famous Indian dishes in the world. Our dining table was designed to seat 8 people, with 1 chair on each side for the width and 4 chairs on each side for the length. We chose a table with a wooden top covered with solar control film instead of a glass one, so as not to worry about breaking glass. Varun sat on one of the chairs across the width of the table, and Jacques and I sat on chairs along the length, opposite each other. We started eating dinner, and both men complimented my cooking skills. Jacques seemed to really like the biryani, and I was relieved that he didn't find it too spicy for his taste. We talked about various things. Mostly Varun asked Jacques about his work and other topics. During dinner, I suddenly felt someone's foot touch mine. I instinctively pulled my leg back and continued eating, deciding that it was an accident. But a moment later, I felt it again. This time, the leg touched my foot. I thought it was Varun and looked at him, smiling slightly. He smiled back and continued eating. It was strange. His smile was normal, as if he didn't suspect anything. He smiled just because I smiled. Maybe this is his way of not letting Jacques know that he is playing legs with me. I decided to play along, knowing that my husband sometimes teases me in such a way as to confuse and excite me. He liked to see how nervous I was. But I soon realized that something was wrong. Varun was sitting to my left, and the leg movement was on my right side at the wrong angle. Then I realized who it was. I looked at Jacques, who was eating, but at the same time casting sly glances at me and smiling. The angle of approach of the foot turned out to be precise, and I realized that it was him. I gave him a stern look, hoping that would make him stop. However, this did not stop him. His foot slowly slid up, brushing my salwar and touching my calf. My breathing became rapid. I tried to remain calm so that Varun wouldn't notice and continued eating. When Jacques' foot reached my thigh, I winced and started coughing. Varun looked at me in surprise and immediately offered me water, thinking that I had choked on my food. It wasn't actually the pepper in the biryani, but Jacques' leg on my thigh. When I coughed, Jacques immediately removed his foot and pretended to be surprised and worried. Little rascal, I thought, noticing how he smiled when I stopped coughing. For some time, everything was calm, and I thought that Jacques had finished his pranks for today. But I was wrong. His foot was on my thigh again, and this time I didn't react. She slowly moved between my legs, and without realizing it, I spread my legs, giving him more space. I felt his legs slowly rising higher, closer to the most intimate place. With every centimeter, my breathing became more and more rapid, and my heart began to beat like a mad drum. Jacques knew what he was doing. He was well aware of how excited I was, and at the same time understood that I could not do anything. I fought with myself, trying not to show anything on my face. Varun continued to eat his dinner calmly, not even suspecting what was happening right in front of his eyes. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on my breathing. Jacques boldly continued his game, realizing that I could not stop him without attracting my husband's attention. My hands began to shake, and I could barely hold the fork. There was almost no willpower left, and I felt a wave of excitement cover me. But then Varun suddenly stood up from the table, taking his plate. "Thank you, Ria. The biryani was amazing," he said, heading towards the kitchen. I was in a panic, but at the same time I felt great relief. Jacques removed his foot, and I exhaled sharply. Looking up at him, I saw him looking at me with a sly, satisfied smile. "Are you crazy?" I hissed, abruptly removing his leg from my thigh. "Oh, relax," he said, pretending to stick out his tongue. "Stop this right now," I ordered, trying to speak more quietly so that Varun wouldn't hear. Jacques just grinned and shrugged. I got up from the table, collected my plate, and went to the kitchen. I needed to come to my senses, and I decided to start cleaning so as not to return to their living room. I heard Varun and Jacques continue talking and watching TV. After about half an hour, Varun called me. "Ria, Jacques is leaving. Come, say goodbye." I went into the living room and saw Jacques standing at the open door. He was ready to leave, but his gaze pierced me again. "Thank you for the delicious dinner," he said in his accent, looking at me with the same sly smile. "It was our pleasure," Varun replied, shaking his hand. "Yes, but there was something especially pleasant for me," Jacques added, casting a last glance at me. Only I understood what he meant. "Good night," he said as he left. After Jacques left, I went back to cleaning, but Varun had other plans. Since he was leaving the next day, he came over to me, picked me up, and carried me to the bedroom to spend some time together. We ended up on the bed, enjoying the intimacy with each other. I felt his gentle touch as he hugged me, and I stroked his back. Varun gently placed his hand on my head, and the other gently touched my chest, creating a feeling of warmth and care. I was immersed in this moment, and all my thoughts and feelings were focused on him. We exchanged tender kisses, trying to make the most of the time we had. Varun was gentle and attentive, and I knew how much he missed me while he was at sea. We both treasured these moments together, especially after months of being apart. I closed my eyes, enjoying this closeness, until the memories of the previous evening surfaced before me. I remembered how Jacques touched my hand under the dinner table and how our eyes met. Those moments still lingered in my mind, but I tried to focus on the present, on Varun and our connection. We continued to enjoy each other, trying to remember every detail of this moment. Varun held me close to him, and I felt his warmth, his love. These moments were a real reward for the patience and loyalty that we showed while we were apart, and I was grateful for every moment spent next to him. "Wow, Ree, that was amazing," Varun said as he passed by. I just continued to look at him without saying a word. I shifted my position slightly, allowing him to come closer. He gently lifted my legs, and his touch was soft and sure. Our intimacy was filled with warmth and mutual understanding, and he penetrated me completely, holding me close to him. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling his breath next to me. Varun leaned towards me, putting his arm around my shoulders, and our bodies began to move in the same rhythm. His movements became more and more intense, and I began to feel the waves of pleasure growing. With my eyes closed, I tried to focus on the present moment, but my thoughts began to play with me again. The image of Jacques appeared before my eyes, and I could not drive it away. I could smell his cologne, remembering the evening I met him. These thoughts intensified my sensations, and I again reached the pinnacle of pleasure. I held Varun tightly, feeling the intensity of emotion that's taking over both of us. His touch, my breathing, and the tension of the moment brought us to a common ending. When it was over, we looked at each other and thoughts of Jacques finally disappeared. I was able to focus on my husband, clearly aware of his presence next to me. I grabbed his face and pulled him into a kiss, and he responded enthusiastically too. He spent the next few minutes in each other's arms, kissing and occasionally lowering his head to kiss my breasts. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click